Hi, I'm Marceline. Last week, my mother told me not to embarrass the family at my own father's retirement dinner. She said I didn't belong there. Then she sent my brother to block me at the front entrance of the $7 billion hotel they thought they owned. They didn't know I held the deed. They didn't know the entire empire they were protecting was mine. But that night, when the maitre d' bowed and whispered, "Welcome back, ma'am," their smiles vanished. And that's when I realized it wasn't about reclaiming my place. It was about burning down the lie they built around me and walking through the ashes wearing my name. Tell me, what would you have done if your own family erased you from your own legacy? I was halfway through answering an email when the notification pinged. A message from my cousin, Lydia. Subject line, "Just so you know." Attached was a single image, the official invitation list for my father's retirement dinner. I scrolled once, twice, then again, slower this time, as if my name might appear if I stared long enough. Evelyn Cross, Trenton Cross, their spouses, family friends, the board of directors. My father, of course. No Marceline. I let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. "Typical," I whispered, the word sliding off my tongue like an old habit. My phone felt heavier in my hand. For a few moments, I just sat there at my desk, watching the Los Angeles skyline shift from daylight to the honeyed hue of early evening. Down below, traffic hummed. Steady, predictable, unlike the people who shared my last name. I dialed my mother before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the second ring, voice smooth as glass. "Marceline, darling, it's late. Everything all right?" "I got the invitation list," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "My name isn't there." There was a small pause, long enough for her to decide how to frame the insult. "Oh, sweetheart, it's not that kind of event. It's formal. You wouldn't want to embarrass your father." The words hit softly, but I felt the sharp edge underneath. I swallowed once. "Embarrass him? I own the hotel you're hosting it in." A light laugh, the kind she used when dismissing a waiter. "Then consider it poetic. You'll be there in spirit." She hung up before I could say another word. I stared at the phone, at the faint reflection of my own face on the screen. Calm, poised. Only my hands betrayed me, trembling just enough to blur the outline of my thumbprint. A few minutes later, my assistant Sophia walked in, carrying a stack of folders. "You okay? You look like you just read bad news." I turned my laptop toward her. The news alert was already trending. "Prominent CEO celebrates legacy at Azure Grand. Hosted by family." Trenton's face smiled from the thumbnail, smug as always. Beneath it, event sponsor, Trenton Cross. No mention of me. No mention of Azure Holdings. Sophia's jaw dropped. "They used your property, your brand, without credit?" I nodded, closing the laptop gently. "That's what family does best," I said quietly. "Take what's yours and call it tradition." For the rest of the day, I tried to bury myself in work, reviewing contracts, approving blueprints. But my mind kept looping back to her voice. "You wouldn't want to embarrass your father." It wasn't the exclusion that stung. It was the reminder that in her eyes, I was still the quiet one, the helper, the shadow behind my brother's light. I remembered sitting on the floor of my father's office as a child, sorting papers he'd toss aside. He used to pat my head and say, "You'll make a fine assistant someday, Marcy." Maybe that's why I built an empire, to prove him wrong without ever saying it out loud. And yet, here I was, still invisible to the people I'd spent a lifetime trying to impress. Night fell quickly. The city outside my window shimmered with streetlights. I poured myself a glass of water, trying to shake the ache in my chest, when my phone buzzed again. A new message. From her. Do not come to the dinner, Marceline. You can't afford it, and we won't cover your bill this time. Don't make a scene. I reread it twice, maybe 3 times. Not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted to memorize the exact shape of her cruelty. I smiled. Not the kind born of humor, the kind that comes from knowing exactly how the next game will play out. Afford it, I murmured, setting the phone down. You'll wish that were true. I stood, walked to my closet, and took out my purse. My fingers brushed against the cool metal of my keycard, embossed with the azure emblem. My hotel, my name, even if they'd erased it from the invitations. Sliding it into the side pocket, I whispered, Fine, let's see who really owns this family's pride. I locked up my office and stepped into the night. The air was thick, electric, that kind of California humidity that promises a storm. As I drove through downtown, headlights flickering across wet asphalt, the Azure Grand rose in the distance like a crown of glass and steel. The building glowed blue against the dark sky, elegant, proud, untouchable, just like my mother had always wanted to be. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, the city lights streaking past like memories I couldn't quite let go of. The email, the phone call, the text. Each one had chipped away a piece of something I'd tried to protect, the illusion that blood meant belonging. When the first drops of rain tapped against the windshield, I smiled again. It felt right. A storm on the night I decided to stop being quiet. By the time I pulled into the guest parking lot at Azure Grand, the rain had shifted from a soft patter to a steady rhythm. Not quite a storm yet, but close. I didn't use the owner's reserved spot tucked near the private elevator. Tonight wasn't about proving something with a parking space. The windshield wipers squeaked once before I shut the car off. I took one long breath, checked my lipstick in the rearview mirror, and stepped out. My heels clicked against the wet pavement, echoing faintly under the glow of the awning lights. Across the street, the tower shimmered. Every floor alight like it had something to celebrate. Through the floor-to-ceiling lobby windows, I saw gold chandeliers, velvet drapes, and trays of champagne catching the light. It looked perfect, like them. My fingers grazed the keycard inside my purse, but I didn't take it out yet. I didn't need proof. I just needed the door to open. I made my way up the stone steps slowly, deliberately, ignoring the looks from the valet crew. Most of them had worked here for years. They knew who I was. I nodded once at Miguel, who gave a hesitant half-bow, unsure of what to do. The grand glass doors slid open, and then didn't. I stopped short, a half step from the red carpet. And then I saw him. Trenton. He stood just inside the threshold, arms crossed, mouth curled into that signature smirk he wore like cologne. Expensive, suffocating, and completely fake. "Wow," he said. "You really did show up." I met his eyes calmly. "It's my hotel." He chuckled, flicking something invisible off his cuff. "Mom said you'd try something dramatic." I kept my voice steady. "Dramatic is wearing a tuxedo to a dinner you didn't pay for." Trenton gestured toward the valet behind me. "Escort her out. This place doesn't host beggars." The valet froze. I could see the tension in his shoulders. His gaze flicked to mine. A silent question. I shook my head once, subtly. Not tonight. Trenton stepped forward and, with a smug flick of his wrist, swiped his card at the door panel. The lock clicked. "Guess your card doesn't work here anymore," he said. "Security upgrade. Didn't you hear?" I didn't flinch. I simply reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. One message, just one, sent. He tilted his head. "Calling for backup?" I smiled faintly. I reminded my system who it belongs to. A soft beep sounded from the door. Then another. The electronic locks disengaged. A distinct mechanical click-click. Behind Trenton, The concierge desk lit up. The evening manager, Alan, stepped forward. He looked past Trenton and bowed slightly. "Good evening, Ms. Cross. Welcome back." Trenton's jaw twitched. What did you do?" I stepped through the threshold, brushing past him gently. "Nothing you haven't tried yourself. Just better." Inside, the air was thick with perfume and chatter. Glasses clinked. Laughter floated from the yee. Ballroom down the hall. I spotted Evelyn near the entrance, giving quiet orders to a floral attendant. She turned, caught sight of me, and her smile dropped half an inch. Not enough for most people to notice, but I did. She walked toward me, slow and sharp. "You think this makes you look strong?" she hissed under her breath. "It makes you look pathetic." I didn't blink. "No, Mother. Pretending to be someone you're not, that's pathetic." Her eyes narrowed. For a moment, I saw the woman behind the mask, the one who used shame as currency and silence as control. Then she turned and disappeared into the crowd. I moved toward the edge of the ballroom, weaving between people who didn't know me or pretended not to. Somewhere in the middle of it all, my father was shaking hands, smiling his well-practiced smile. A waiter approached with a silver tray, and on it sat a neatly folded napkin, a delicate bird, wings tucked in, just like the ones my mother used to make at dinner parties when I was little. I looked at it for a moment, didn't touch it. "Beautiful work," I said softly, then walked away. The band started up inside, a jazz rendition of something old and familiar. I stood just outside the ballroom entrance, watching the family act like the world hadn't shifted. My jaw tightened. They wanted silence. They were going to get it, but not the kind they expected. My phone buzzed in my hand, a number I didn't recognize. "They're planning something tonight. Be careful." I stared at the screen, the light casting shadows across the polished floor. I lowered the phone slowly, the glow fading from my hand. The words lingered. "They're planning something tonight. Be careful." A warning, anonymous but too specific to ignore. I slipped the phone into my clutch and took a steady breath. The ballroom doors loomed ahead, tall carved glass, etched with the azure insignia. My insignia. Inside, laughter spilled out in waves, bright and brittle. The music swelled as the MC announced my father's entrance. I pushed the doors open. For a moment, the light hit me like a stage spotlight. Dozens of faces turned, curious, uncertain, then almost in unison, they turned away. Pretending not to see me was an art form in my family, and they were all masters of it. The ballroom shimmered in gold and silver. Chandeliers reflected across the marble floor, soft jazz filled the air, and cameras flashed in a rhythmic dance. My father stood near the center, shaking hands, nodding graciously, every inch the corporate patriarch. His smile was tight but practiced, the kind that never quite reached his eyes. I stood near the entrance, invisible in plain sight. Above the stage, a massive digital banner glowed, celebrating 40 years of leadership. The Cross family legacy. My gaze drifted down the names scrolling beneath the title, Evelyn Cross, Trenton Cross. Even Lydia, my cousin, made the cut, but not me. A low murmur spread through the tables closest to the door. I caught fragments, soft, sharp whispers that pricked at the edges of my composure. "Isn't that the daughter who went bankrupt?" "No, she sued her own family, didn't she?" "I heard she was unstable." I smiled, small and deliberate. Let them talk. Words were just smoke, and smoke always cleared. From across the room, I saw Evelyn directing the photographers with her usual poise, wearing a gown the color of champagne and an expression that said she owned the air itself. She didn't look at me, but she knew I was there. Every movement of hers, every tilt of her chin, carried that subtle performance. I'm fine. She's irrelevant. As a waiter passed, I caught a glimpse of the napkins folded into perfect white birds. The same pattern my mother taught me decades ago. I could still hear her voice. "Fold it neatly, dear. How you set the table shows who you are." I was 10. My fingers had fumbled, the creases never quite straight. She'd smiled, but her tone had cut deep. Messy hands, messy future. Now, watching her command the crowd, I understood. She hadn't been teaching me etiquette, she'd been shaping control. Every fold, every gesture, another way to remind me where I stood, beneath her thumb. The MC's voice broke through the haze. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the matriarch of the Cross family, Mrs. Evelyn Cross." Applause filled the room. Cameras clicked like crickets in summer. Evelyn glided to the microphone, elegant and composed, her voice smooth as silk. "Tonight," she began, "we celebrate not only a remarkable career, but the people who made this legacy possible." Her gaze swept the crowd, pausing on Trenton. "To my son, Trenton, for carrying the torch and managing the company's future. We are so proud of you." More applause. Flashes. My brother grinned, soaking it in. Then, a pause. I knew it before she said it. "And to my daughter." Her tone softened, but her smile didn't. "Who chose a different path." A few polite chuckles rippled through the room. I could almost feel the pity. That familiar sting of humiliation crept up the back of my neck, but I didn't let it show. I raised my glass slightly toward her and whispered, "Just for me. You taught me silence, but you never learned how powerful it can be." As she basked in her applause, I noticed Raymond standing near the service door, watching me. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before discreetly slipping a folded note into my hand as he passed behind me. I opened it under the tablecloth. "Your mother requested accounting to transfer Azure Grand ownership records to the Cross Family Trust. Effective tomorrow morning." My chest tightened. The message from earlier flashed through my mind. They're planning something tonight. Now I understood. They weren't just cutting me out socially. They were preparing to erase me legally. I looked up, meeting Evelyn's gaze from across the room. She was smiling, radiant, untouchable, a queen on her throne. I smiled back, the kind of smile that hides a knife behind it. I stood, quietly pushing my chair back. The guests barely noticed as I slipped out the side door. The waiter stationed nearby glanced at me. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Good luck, ma'am." I nodded once. He knew. They all knew who truly owned this place. The hallway was cooler, quieter, a world away from the laughter and applause inside. I passed the mirrored wall, catching my reflection. My face looked calm, but there was a new sharpness in my eyes, something colder, clearer. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. The faint reflection of the screen glowed against the mirror. I pressed record. "You wanted a family picture," I said softly, almost smiling. "Let's make sure the world sees the real one." The recording light blinked once, then faded as I slipped the phone back into my purse. My heels clicked against the marble as I moved deeper into the corridor, away from the laughter and the sound of champagne glasses, meeting like nothing in the world could go wrong. The noise grew quieter with each step, replaced by the hum of air vents and the low murmur of the building's control systems. I knew exactly where I was going. The control room sat behind a nondescript gray door labeled Maintenance. I pressed my keycard to the panel, and it unlocked with a soft beep. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and electronics, a comforting kind of control. Walls lined with monitors cast pale light across the room. Every corner of the hotel played out in real time: the ballroom, the lobby, the kitchen, the service elevators. Raymond Hale stood beside the main console, arms crossed, his expression unreadable until he turned and saw me. "Ma'am," he said quietly. I had a feeling this wasn't just a dinner. I gave a small, tired smile. No, Ray, it's a takeover, just not the kind they'll be celebrating with champagne. He reached for a folder sitting on the desk, sliding it across the surface toward me. This came through our internal system an hour ago. Accounting flagged it, said it didn't look right. Inside were 2 printed pages. My eyes scanned the lines. Transfer of ownership. Azure Grand Hotel to the Cross Family Trust. Beneath it were 2 signatures. Evelyn Cross, Trenton Cross. Effective midnight tonight. I stared at the ink for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. They planned to steal it while I was standing in the same building. Raymond's jaw tightened. Do you want me to lock them out of the network? I shook my head. No, let them think they've already won. I pulled out my phone and tapped into my encrypted line. My corporate attorney answered on the first ring. Marceline, he said, his voice low and alert. I was just about to call you. Good, I replied. Initiate emergency clause 44C under my holding group. Timestamp it now. I want Azure Grand and all related assets locked under Marceline Holdings before midnight. He hesitated for only a moment. Understood. That'll override any pending transfer. Exactly, I said. And make sure the timestamp is filed with the city clerk before 11. There was a pause, then a sharp click as the digital signature went through. Done, he said. I ended the call and looked at Raymond. Now, I said quietly, let's let them make a scene. He nodded once. Understood. He moved to the main console, typing in a few commands. One of the larger monitors flickered, then displayed the live feed from the ballroom. Evelyn stood at the podium, her hand on my father's shoulder, while Trenton hovered near the front table, trying to appear calm. Patch it to all the main screens, I said. No sound yet. Raymond's fingers flew across the keyboard. Within seconds, every large display in the ballroom, the ones normally showing family photos and event highlights, switched to the live feed from our own security cameras. Evelyn's face filled the screens, her expression flawless, glowing under the spotlight. I leaned against the console, arms folded. Keep it rolling. As I watched her, I remembered being 16, standing beside her at a charity gala, terrified I'd say the wrong thing. I'd smiled until my cheeks hurt. That night, she whispered, a real woman knows when to stay quiet, Marceline. Dignity comes from silence. I hadn't understood it then. I do now. You were right, Mother, I murmured under my breath. Silence does have power, just not the kind you taught me. Raymond's phone buzzed once. He checked it, then handed it to me. The document's been uploaded to every journalist's inbox in the ballroom. Wi-Fi network did the rest. I smiled faintly. Good. On the monitors, the first reactions began. A few guests pulled out their phones, brows furrowing, as notifications appeared. Whispers spread. Evelyn looked confused at first, then irritated. Trenton glanced around, his composure cracking. What's going on? I could almost read his lips. The band faltered mid-song. A hush rippled through the room like a wave. Raymond turned to me. They're unraveling. I stood straight, smoothing the fabric of my dress. Then it's time. I walked toward the door, my steps steady, echoing through the hall. The closer I got to the ballroom, the louder the sound of panic became. Soft gasps, confused murmurs, clinking glasses set down too fast. You sure about this, ma'am? Raymond's voice came softly through my earpiece. Completely, I said. They've spent years controlling the story. Tonight, I write the ending. At the end of the corridor, I paused, the golden light from the ballroom spilling over the polished floor. I could see Evelyn now, pale and rigid, trying to maintain her smile as people showed her their screens. Trenton was whispering to someone at the press table, sweat beading on his temple. Raymond's voice came again, lower this time. "Ma'am, cameras are live. You're on every screen." I took one slow breath, adjusted the strap of my purse, and let my expression settle into calm. "Perfect," I whispered. Then I stepped forward, into the light, into their world, into the place they swore I didn't belong. The light hit my face like heat from a spotlight, but I didn't blink. The room was silent, every conversation, every clink of glass fading into nothing. I could hear my own heartbeat, slow and steady, like a drum announcing a reckoning. The microphone was still on the stand where my mother had left it. Her fingerprints probably still smudged the metal. I stepped up, took it in my hand, and said clearly, "Good evening, everyone. I'm Marceline Cross, apparently the black sheep of this family." A ripple went through the room. Surprise, disbelief, maybe even a bit of fear. Cameras lifted instinctively, the journalists suddenly alert. Evelyn's smile froze halfway across her face, while Trenton's expression flickered between panic and forced calm. I could feel every eye on me. The air was thick enough to slice. "First, I'd like to thank my family," I continued, my tone even. "They told me not to come tonight. They said I couldn't afford to." I smiled faintly. "Turns out they were right, because I don't pay to be here. I own it." A soft murmur broke the quiet, like a wave of confusion rolling through the crowd. And then, as if on cue, the giant screens behind me flickered. The Azure Holdings logo appeared, bright and blue against a black background. Below it, a series of documents filled the screen. Official filings, stamped, dated, signed. The words were impossible to mistake. Marceline Cross, CEO and sole owner, Azure Holdings. A collective gasp filled the room. Trenton turned white. My mother blinked once, twice, her jaw tightening as she realized what she was looking at. I held the microphone steady. "Tonight, I didn't come to embarrass my family," I said softly. "I came to remind them, and all of you, that I built this." The crowd's whispers turned into quiet astonishment. Somewhere near the back, someone clapped once, hesitated, then stopped. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice sweet but trembling. "This is inappropriate, Marceline. This event is for your father, not your—" I cut her off, still calm. "No, Mother. What's inappropriate is forging my signature on a legal document." Gasps. Cameras flashed. Trenton stumbled forward, hands raised as if to calm the situation. "You don't understand. Mom was just trying to—" "Protect herself?" I said, turning to face him. "Yes, I know. That's what she's always done." He froze. Words caught somewhere between his throat and his pride. Evelyn shot him a look sharp enough to cut glass. I turned back to the audience, my voice softer now, but clearer than ever. When you're the youngest, the quiet one, people assume silence means weakness. But silence can also mean patience. It's what builds while others tear down. The crowd was utterly still. My father sat at the center table, his expression unreadable, half pride, half something else. For the first time in my life, he looked like he was actually seeing me. The screens changed again. This time, a video played, a younger version of me in a construction helmet, signing the original deed to Azure Grand. My voice echoed faintly through the speakers. For Azure Grand, built from nothing, for everyone who ever felt unseen. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The quiet in the room made every syllable feel like thunder. Evelyn's hands trembled at her sides. She turned to Trenton and hissed, "Turn it off!" Trenton barked something toward the tech booth, but no one moved. Even the staff knew the truth now. The illusion had shattered, and there was no taping it back together. I looked at my father again. He stood slowly, his gaze sweeping over me like he was measuring what kind of woman I'd become. "You built this?" he asked quietly. I nodded once. "Every brick, every inch, every sleepless night. I built it." Something in his expression softened. Not an apology, not yet, but a recognition that I'd earned my place. Maybe for him, that was as close to love as he could manage. Just then, a waiter approached the stage. In his hand was a folded napkin, shaped like a bird, delicate, precise. The same as before, the same pattern my mother used to make when she was teaching me how to act refined. I took it from him gently. "Funny," I said, looking at it. "You always told me the way you fold a napkin shows who you are. I guess I finally folded mine differently." That drew a few nervous laughs from the crowd, then something else, applause. Tentative at first, then louder, stronger, until it filled the room. Evelyn stood frozen, her face pale beneath her makeup. Trenton sank back in his chair, eyes darting everywhere for an escape. My father didn't clap, but he didn't look away either. When the applause finally faded, Evelyn stepped closer, her voice low and venomous. "You think this makes you powerful? You've just made enemies you can't imagine." I met her gaze, steady and calm. Then they should start imagining fast. I didn't wait for her response. I didn't need one. My words hung in the air like smoke after a fire, visible, lingering, undeniable. By the time the applause died down, the room was already shifting. Journalists whispered into phones, staff exchanged glances, and my family, well, they were already calculating their next move. I knew Evelyn wouldn't let it end on that stage. She'd never walk away from a public humiliation, not without a fight. Later, long after the last guest had slipped out, long after the last flashbulb died, I found myself in my office upstairs. It was still dark outside. Downtown Los Angeles shimmered with sleepy lights reflecting off the rain-slicked streets. The storm had passed sometime before dawn, but its weight still hung in the air. The ballroom below looked like a battlefield. Chairs askew, champagne flutes abandoned mid-toast, cloth napkins crumpled like trampled pride. It felt fitting. I sat at my desk, shoes off, legs folded beneath me, like I used to sit as a little girl on the library floor. There was a kind of stillness in that moment, a fragile, fleeting calm before everything broke open again. Raymond stepped in quietly, carrying the same energy he always brought in moments like this. Quiet strength, calm eyes, no unnecessary questions. "You didn't sleep," he said, though it wasn't really a question. "No," I answered, rubbing my temple. "Neither did they." He held out his tablet. "You need to see this." I reached for it, expecting something routine, maybe another interview request or a security issue. What I saw instead made my stomach tighten. At 5:12 a.m., Evelyn and Trenton had met with the family's legal team. Somehow, probably by coercion, they'd produced a board authorization letter. It wasn't real, my signature was forged, but it was enough to convince one of the banks to temporarily freeze one of my holding accounts. "They're trying to bleed you out before the dust settles," Raymond said softly. "Get ahead of the lawyers, starve your liquidity." I set the tablet down and leaned back. "They think if they cut the flow, I'll fold." He didn't respond. He didn't have to. I glanced at the photo frame on my desk. Me and my father. I was probably 10. We were at a ribbon cutting for one of his early properties. I remembered how proud I'd been to be standing next to him, how tall he looked, how steady. For years, I thought if I could just be like him, tough, smart, unshakable, maybe he'd see me as something more than an afterthought. "He taught me everything about numbers," I said quietly, "but nothing about worth." Raymond didn't interrupt. He knew this wasn't for him. For a moment, I felt the edges of doubt creep in. The years of rejection, of silence, of playing the background while they told the world who mattered and who didn't. It all landed at once. "Maybe they're right," I whispered. "Maybe I'll always be the outsider." I stared out at the morning sky, storm clouds thinning, hints of rose and gold bleeding into the dark. Somewhere in the city, coffee shops were opening, alarms were going off, people were waking up to ordinary lives. Mine was never ordinary. And it wasn't going to be today. My phone buzzed. It was Claire, my attorney. "Tell me," I said, skipping hello. "The family trust just filed a claim in Superior Court. They're officially contesting ownership of Azure Grand," she said. I felt the chill move through me before she added the last part. "And your father's digital signature is on the petition." I closed my eyes. I shouldn't have been surprised, but somehow I was. He'd always been quiet, always withdrawn. But part of me had still hoped. Hoped he wouldn't take sides. Hoped he'd at least stay neutral. "He signed it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Claire paused. "Yes, I'm sorry." I stared at my desk. The polished wood, the framed picture, the silent betrayal. "So that's how it is," I said. When the call ended, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I reached into my bag and pulled out the napkin I'd folded into a bird last night. Its wings were a little bent now, creased, fragile, like everything between me and the people who should have protected me. I unfolded it carefully, flattening it against the desk. Then, slowly, deliberately, I began folding it again. This time the edges were sharper, the lines cleaner, the creases stronger. "They taught me silence," I murmured, "but I learned precision." I picked up the phone. "Raymond," I said, "tell PR to prep a statement." "Going public?" he asked. "No, going surgical." He didn't ask what I meant. He knew. I gave him instructions, what files to leak, which journalists would recognize the threads. Buried in the family's charitable foundation, there were years of small discrepancies. It wouldn't take much to unravel them. Evelyn's empire of good deeds had a rotten core, and now it was time to cut it open. I was halfway through drafting my notes when my screen lit up again, this time with the morning news. The anchor's voice was serious. "Breaking. Accusations of financial misconduct. Rock Azure Holdings as anonymous sources within the Cross family speak out." My stomach dropped. And then came the recording. My mother's voice, clipped from a private phone call. "She's unstable. She's been obsessed with this place for years. This empire was never hers to begin with." I sat frozen, the city humming behind the windows. The trap was set. Carefully timed, professionally executed. They'd known I'd make a move, and they were ready with theirs. I stared at the screen for several long seconds. My hands were clenched in my lap. Then I stood. "They think this is about a company," I said softly. I picked up the phone again. "Raymond, we go on the offensive, now." Raymond didn't ask questions. He just nodded and left the room with his usual quiet precision. The sound of the door clicking shut behind him echoed louder than it should have in the stillness. 48 hours later, the war felt quieter on the outside, but inside, everything was grinding, building, waiting to snap. I hadn't left the executive suite since the scandal broke. Not because I was hiding, because I was hunting. 3 monitors lit up the room with a cold blue hue. Financial reports, legal documents, press clippings. The city outside buzzed with traffic, but in here it felt like I was underwater, watching everything move in slow motion, calculating the next hit. Raymond walked in mid-morning with his sleeves rolled up, holding a mug and a look that said something had cracked. "She's flooding the media," he said. "Your mother's team has bought out space on every major outlet. They're spinning the narrative hard." I didn't look up. "Let them." He crossed the room and set the mug beside me. "You've got something better?" "We're going to give them what they didn't ask for," I said, finally raising my eyes. "The truth." He paused, then reached into his bag and pulled out a flash drive. "You might want to see this." I plugged it in, half expecting another headline, but instead I saw files I hadn't opened in years. My old encrypted archive, back when I used to record board meetings out of pure paranoia. Where did you find these? You hid them inside the archive of the Grand's architecture files. Clever. I clicked open one labeled E-Cross Private 3. Evelyn's voice spilled through the speakers, calm and cold. If we fake her signature, the trust will absorb the assets by default. By the time she finds out, the ink will be dry. I sat back, fingers tightening around the edge of the desk. She always said, "Nothing stays hidden forever," I murmured. Guess she was right. Raymond studied me carefully. This is everything. You can end her." I stared at the screen. I could feel it, the weight of power in my hands. But it wasn't satisfying. Not yet. "If I release this," I said slowly, "it'll ruin her. Not just her career, her entire name. Everything she built." He stepped closer. "After what she did to you? After the lies? The fraud?" "I know." I looked down. "But if I become her, then what's left of me?" For a few moments, we both just stood there. No decisions, no noise. Just the question, justice or vengeance. And then it clicked. I don't have to destroy her. I just have to pull the right thread. That evening, I issued a quiet, surgical leak. Not the recordings, not the voice clips. Just one internal audit report from Evelyn's nonprofit. It showed a mismatch in donor funds, small enough to look like an error, big enough to raise red flags. By morning, the headlines had flipped. Federal auditors question cross. Foundation. Anonymous source leaks suggest financial discrepancies. Is the cross name still untouchable? Evelyn exploded. Trenton called me 3 times. I didn't answer. Later that day, Raymond came in with a grin. "She's unraveling," screamed at 3 PR firms before breakfast. "She'll blame Trenton next," I muttered. "She already is." We both knew it would only get worse. That night, I slipped down to the hotel restaurant. The room was quiet, only a few guests left in the corners. My usual table by the window was waiting, and as I sat, the same waiter approached, the one who'd handed me that napkin shaped like a bird the night of the gala. This time, he placed a napkin folded into a phoenix beside my plate. "That's new," I said, surprised. "You inspired it, ma'am," he replied, bowing slightly. I picked it up and studied the wings. It wasn't perfect, but it was rising. I laid it flat and whispered, "Rise from the ashes." 2 days later, I stood at the podium of the same ballroom they tried to erase me from. This time, I wasn't the black sheep. I was the voice. "Transparency has always been our foundation," I told the press. "Any allegations made against me will be addressed the right way, with evidence and truth." Reporters fired off questions like gunshots. I answered them all, direct, calm, unshaken. "Was your family involved in the original ownership transfer?" "Yes." "Are you pursuing legal action?" "No comment at this time." "Do you think this war will end soon?" I met the reporter's eyes. "It's not a war, it's an unveiling." As I stepped off stage, Raymond was waiting near the side curtain. "They're panicking," he whispered. "Your mother's charity accounts are frozen. Media sympathy's turning." Good. I didn't celebrate. I didn't flinch. I just walked back to the suite. That night, I stood by the window again, watching the city turn gold under streetlights. There was a strange calm in me now, like I'd finally exhaled after holding my breath too long. "It's not over," I said under my breath. "She'll strike again. She always does." Raymond's phone buzzed behind me. He checked it, brows furrowing. "You were right," he said. "She's moving something offshore. Cayman Islands. Quiet accounts." I turned slowly, my pulse steady. "Then it's time we follow the money," I said, voice cold. "All the way to the end. The rain had started somewhere along the drive, soft at first, then relentless. I watched the wipers move in steady rhythm across the windshield as Raymond guided the car up the winding path to Evelyn's cliffside villa in Malibu. The sky was a heavy shade of gray, like the whole world had decided to hold its breath. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been laid bare. When we pulled through the gate, the air shifted, dense with salt and storm, but more than that. The house stood perched above the ocean like a throne, too proud to admit it was crumbling. I stepped out, heels crunching on the stone path. Behind me, Raymond retrieved the envelope from the glove box, sealed, stamped, undeniable. Inside, the lights were dimmed low, but the tension hit like floodlights. Evelyn stood near the window in a tailored suit, arms crossed, lips tight. Trenton was already seated at the long dining table, fingers tapping nervously against the wood. My father stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, eyes not meeting mine. "You've humiliated us enough," Evelyn said, turning just slightly. "What more do you want?" I didn't hesitate. "To end this." Raymond entered behind me, silent, professional. He placed the envelope on the table between us, along with a small tablet. "These are the offshore records," I said quietly. "Transfers traced back to accounts in the Caymans, all under your maiden name, pulled from your nonprofit's books." Trenton stared at the documents, his face draining of color. "Mom, tell me this isn't real." "They're fakes," she snapped. "Fabrications. She's manipulating you." Raymond tapped the tablet. Audio began to play. Evelyn's voice filled the room. "Move everything before she finds out. Don't wait for the board." She went rigid. For a moment, all you could hear was the rain tapping against the glass. Then, from the corner, my father spoke for the first time in weeks. "Enough." We all turned. "I knew," he said softly. "About the forged signatures, about the trust documents. I let it happen." His voice cracked, the weight of guilt crushing the arrogance he once wore so well. I didn't want to admit that my daughter had built something I never could. I didn't cry, not then. I just looked at him, the man who had once taught me to add before I could spell, who'd sat in silence while they tried to erase me. "You could have stopped her," I said. He nodded. "I know, and I was wrong." Evelyn's face contorted, rage rising to the surface. She lunged across the table, snatching for the phone in my hand, but Raymond was faster. He stepped between us, voice steady. "This conversation is being recorded, Mrs. Cross." She froze mid-reach, realizing too late that every word, every move was now evidence. The door opened. 2 family lawyers entered quietly, called in at Raymond's request. They stood off to the side, saying nothing, but watching everything. Evelyn's empire didn't collapse in silence. It shattered with the sound of her own denial echoing through the room. As she was escorted out, a maid moved through with practiced ease, clearing glasses, napkins, plates. She paused at the edge of the table, picked up a crumpled cloth, and replaced it with one folded carefully into the shape of a bird, with one wing slightly torn. After they left, I reached for it, fingers tracing the edge. "Even broken wings can learn to fly again," I whispered. Trenton stood now, eyes rimmed red, but not from anger, from shame. "I didn't know," he said, voice low. "Not really. She said you were dangerous, that you'd ruin the family." I met his gaze, not with bitterness, but with truth. "You have a choice, Trenton. Keep hiding behind her shadow, or start building something of your own, but don't expect both." He looked away, but he nodded. My father stepped closer, stopping just short of touching my arm. "Can you forgive me?" he asked. I turned to the window, the storm outside just starting to fade. "Forgiveness isn't the point anymore," I said. "Accountability is." 3 hours later, the headlines broke. Evelyn Cross arrested in financial fraud investigation. Federal agents seize documents from Cross Foundation. Marceline Cross emerges as voice of transparency. By the time I stepped into the lobby of the Azure Grand again, everything felt still. Staff stood waiting, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. I nodded once. "Welcome home, Ms. Cross," someone said gently. And for the first time in years, I believed it. "This time," I said, "it really is." Raymond approached from the elevator, expression unreadable. In his hand, another envelope, this one older, heavier, labeled confidential, Azure Holdings Founding Agreement. "It's about your father," he said quietly. "And it changes everything." I didn't flinch. I took it from his hands, heart steady. "Then let's finish what they started." The envelope sat untouched on my desk for a week. Every day I saw it resting there, pristine, sealed, quietly waiting. I wasn't avoiding it out of fear. I was waiting for the noise to die down, for the dust of war to settle, and for my hands to stop trembling. Sunset filtered through the penthouse windows, casting long golden beams over the Los Angeles skyline. The city below had found its rhythm again, and so had I. Raymond entered without knocking, carrying 2 mugs of tea. One glance at the envelope told him everything. "You ready?" he asked gently. I didn't answer. I just reached for it, slid a finger under the flap, and opened it. Inside was a letter, aged, creased, handwritten, but never sent. No signature. The handwriting was unmistakable, my father's. It was addressed to Evelyn. The words were raw, unsure, his way of confessing something too big to carry any longer. He spoke of my grandmother's gift, how she left the seed money for the Azure Grand entirely in my name before she passed. Not to the family, not to the business, to me. But Evelyn had drafted false documents years ago, slipping in a clause that gave ownership to her and my father. It was forged, quiet, clean. Everything I'd fought for, clawed my way back to. It had already been mine from the beginning. Raymond didn't say a word. He just waited. Finally, I looked up and let out a breath. All those years, I was trying to earn a place in a world that was already mine. There was no bitterness in my voice, just the kind of laugh that comes after you finally solve a puzzle you didn't know was broken. "Maybe the universe has a twisted sense of humor," I added. Raymond smiled faintly. "Or maybe it waits until we're strong enough to carry the truth." Behind me, the framed napkin, the phoenix from that night at the villa, glimmered under the fading light. I stood and walked to it, my fingers grazing the glass. "Fly higher this time," I whispered. Later that week, my father came to the office. He looked smaller now, not just older, smaller, like someone who'd spent his whole life playing the wrong part in a play that never fit him. Raymond helped him to the chair across from me, then quietly stepped out. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, voice low and thin. "I'm not here to carry your guilt," I replied. He nodded. "You were always the one who saw through all of us." I gestured to the city outside. I was just busy building something while everyone else played pretend. A long silence stretched between us before he said, almost to himself, "You built something beautiful." "No," I corrected. "I rebuilt what they broke." He didn't argue. 3 days later, the Azure Grand reopened with a new purpose. We launched the Phoenix Foundation that same morning. Its mission's simple: support for young entrepreneurs, especially women who had been shut out, silenced, or cast aside by their families. It wasn't about charity. It was about redemption, of legacy, of strength, of voice. That afternoon, I sat with Daria Monroe, the journalist who had followed the story from the start. She was younger than me by 20 years, but carried herself with the same fire I once buried deep. "Why the name?" she asked. "The Phoenix Foundation?" I looked at the framed napkin again, smiled. Because sometimes the ashes are where the truth begins. The feature aired that weekend. By Monday morning, our inbox overflowed with letters. Not business inquiries, not praise, stories. From women across the country who had survived something similar. Some had been disinherited, some silenced, some were still fighting, and suddenly, it didn't feel like I'd won a war. It felt like I'd started something that needed to exist. A few evenings later, I returned to Evelyn's old villa. It was empty now, tied up in federal claims. The curtains had been pulled from the windows. The gardens had grown wild, but the ocean still moved the same. I stood by the railing, the very place she once told me I didn't belong. I took one last folded napkin from my coat pocket. Not a phoenix this time, just a simple shape, a boat. "I forgive you," I said softly. "Not for you, for me." I let it go, watching the tiny paper vessel drift out on the tide until the waves swallowed it whole. That night, back on the rooftop of the Grand, Raymond poured 2 glasses of wine and handed me one. "So," he asked, "what's next?" I tilted my glass, watching the way the light caught the red swirl. For once, I didn't feel the urge to plan or protect or predict. "Living," I said. "Really living." We clinked glasses. The city shimmered below us. I breathed in, slow, steady. Then my phone buzzed on the table. One message, anonymous. "There's another account, offshore, in your name." I stared at it for a moment, lips curling into the smallest smile. I looked at Raymond. "Then the story isn't over yet,"